Charlie was the only one I could talk to in a completely natural and simple way. He was dear to me, and I miss him very much. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon wrote those words in 1919. She was 19 years old. The boy she was writing about, Charles Gordon-Lennox, Lord Settrington, had just died of wounds in a military hospital in northern Russia. He was 20. He'd survived the entire First World War. He'd been captured by the Germans, held as a prisoner, released after the armistice. The war was over. He was safe. And then he volunteered for one more deployment, to Russia, into a conflict that had nothing to do with him, and he didn't come home. She called him my only true friend, 19 years old, and she'd already lost the only person in the world she didn't have to pretend with. Now, most people hearing this don't connect that girl with the woman they know. The Queen Mother, the wave, the hats, the pastel dresses, the gin and tonic in one hand and a racing form in the other. The woman who showed up to 100 public events a year well into her 90s, who lived to 101, who the country called the Queen Mum, the nation's grandmother, the most beloved royal of the 20th century. That's the version the public knew. That's the version the palace wanted you to see, and it was real. She really was warm. She really did light up a room. She really did have that smile that made people feel like she'd known them forever. But behind the smile was a woman who'd been carrying grief since she was 15 years old, and she never put it down. Not once, not publicly, not in 87 years. At 15, she lost her brother Fergus on a battlefield in France. His leg was blown off by artillery. He died in a sergeant's arms. His body was buried in a quarry, and the grave was lost. Her family spent decades not knowing exactly where he lay. At 19, she lost Charlie, the first person she'd ever loved. At 36, she was forced onto the throne by a brother-in-law who chose a woman over his country. She never forgave him. She believed the stress of kingship killed her husband. She carried that belief for 66 years. At 51, she watched that husband, the stammering, gentle, reluctant king she'd spent 29 years protecting, die in his sleep at 56. She wore black for a year. She retreated to Scotland. She didn't speak publicly for months. She watched her youngest daughter fall in love with a man the system wouldn't let her marry. She watched that daughter's spirit break, slowly, over decades, and couldn't stop it. She carried a family secret involving two of her own nieces, girls who were locked in a mental institution in 1941 and declared dead in official records, even though they were still alive. One of them was buried in a pauper's grave, marked with a plastic tag. No family attended the funeral, and then, at 101, she buried her youngest daughter. 7 weeks later, she was gone. This is a story that spans nearly the entire 20th century, from a telegram delivered to a castle in Scotland in 1915 to a quiet death at Royal Lodge in the spring of 2002. 87 years of grief, folded up and carried in silence, behind the most famous smile in British public life. And the reason she never let anyone see it, the reason she built that mask and wore it every single day for nearly a century, starts before the throne, before the war, before any of it. It starts with who she was before the world took everything from her. But to understand what that silence cost her, and what it protected, you've got to go back to a castle in Scotland, where a 14-year-old girl was writing letters for wounded soldiers who couldn't hold a pen, where the hallways smelled like antiseptic and bandages, where the sound of men crying in the night had become ordinary, and where a telegram was about to arrive that would change everything about who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was, and who she'd have to become. If this is your first time here, we tell these stories the way they deserve to be told. No shortcuts. No tabloid noise, just the real history, from the people who lived it. Hit subscribe and stay, because what you're about to hear is the part of this woman's story the palace never wanted told. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4, 1900. Her father forgot to register the birth for 6 weeks. Officially, the records say she was born at the family estate at St. Paul's Walden Bury in Hertfordshire, but it's now generally accepted she was actually born somewhere in London. One old story even claims it happened in the back seat of a horse-drawn ambulance. None of that mattered much at the time. What mattered was the family she was born into, and the world that family occupied. Her father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, Lord Glamis, who'd later become the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her mother was Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck, descended from a British Prime Minister and a Governor-General of India. They weren't royals, they were aristocrats. Old money, old land, old titles, but not the crown. That distinction would matter later, more than anyone in the family could have predicted. Elizabeth was the 9th of 10 children. Her oldest sister, Violet, had died in 1893, 7 years before Elizabeth was born. The rest were a sprawling, noisy, chaotic crew: Mary, Patrick, John, Alexander, Fergus, Rose, Michael, Elizabeth, and the youngest, David. It was David she was closest to. The two of them, the babies of the family, were inseparable. Their mother called them "my two Benjamins," after the youngest son of Jacob in the Bible. They did everything together. They were practically twins despite the 2-year age gap, and they had exactly the kind of childhood you'd expect from two unsupervised children living in a Scottish castle with too much time and not enough supervision. They threw what they called boiling oil from the castle ramparts onto arriving guests. It was actually ice-cold water, but the effect was the same. They placed a football under the wheels of the family motor car so it would explode and terrify the chauffeur. They ran wild through Glamis Castle, a building that had been standing since the 14th century, with turrets and battlements and corridors that went on forever, and treated it like their personal playground. Glamis Castle. That's the setting you need to hold in your mind for the rest of this story. It's in Angus, in the Scottish Highlands. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited castles in Britain. Shakespeare set Macbeth there. It had ghost stories, legends, and a reputation for being one of the most haunted buildings in Scotland, and it was Elizabeth's home. Not a weekend retreat, not a holiday house. Home. St. Paul's Waldenbury, down in Hertfordshire, was the other family seat. Gentler, greener, more English. The family split their time between the two. Elizabeth's formal education came mostly from her mother and a succession of governesses. She wasn't sent away to school. She was raised inside these houses, inside this family, inside a world that still felt, in the first decade of the 20th century, like it might last forever. Her father was kind but traditional. Her mother was warm, cultured, and deeply involved in her children's lives. There were horses, gardens, dogs, games, pranks, enormous family dinners, and the comfortable certainty that things would always be this way. Elizabeth was born in the last year of Queen Victoria's reign. She grew up in the Edwardian era, an age of long summers, country houses, and the absolute conviction among the British aristocracy that the world was stable, that the empire was permanent, and that nothing could touch the life they'd built. That conviction lasted exactly 14 years. Then August 1914. Elizabeth had just turned 14, and 4 of her brothers put on uniforms and went to war. Patrick joined the Grenadier Guards. John and Fergus joined the Black Watch. Michael joined the Royal Scots. 4 sons from one family, sent to fight the same war on the same Western Front at the same time. And Glamis Castle, the castle where Elizabeth had thrown ice water off the ramparts and terrorized the chauffeur, was converted into a convalescent hospital for wounded soldiers. Overnight, the hallways that had echoed with children's laughter were filled with men on stretchers. The rooms where the Bowes-Lyon family had held dinner parties and dances became wards. The smell changed, the sound changed, everything changed. Elizabeth, 14 years old, then 15, then 16, helped run it. She worked alongside her mother Cecilia and her older sister Rose. But this wasn't decorative charity work. This wasn't a lady of the house popping in to smile at the patients. Elizabeth was in it. She wrote letters for soldiers whose hands were too damaged to hold a pen. She ran errands to buy their tobacco. She played cards with them, round after round, hand after hand, because sometimes the only thing that kept a man from thinking about what had happened to him was a game of cards with a 15-year-old girl who treated him like a human being instead of a casualty. One of those soldiers wrote in her autograph book that she should be hung, drawn, and quartered. It was a joke, a soldier's dark humor, directed at the girl who'd beaten him at cards one too many times, who'd made him laugh when nothing else could. It tells you everything about what Elizabeth was like in that hospital. She wasn't delicate, she wasn't performing sympathy, she was in the room. Present, real, the soldiers could feel it. She later said that this experience, 4 years of living alongside wounded men, of hearing their stories, of watching them arrive broken and leave either healed or dead, was what taught her to talk to anyone, any background, any class, any circumstance. The woman who'd later walk through the bomb-shattered East End and make hardened Londoners weep wasn't trained for it by the palace. She was trained for it at Glamis, at 15, by soldiers who needed her to be something more than an aristocrat's daughter. Then came the fire. September 16th, 1916. 2 soldiers discovered flames in a room under the castle roof. They ran to raise the alarm. The first person they found was Elizabeth. She was 16 years old. She didn't panic. She didn't run for help. She picked up the telephone and called both the local fire brigade and the Dundee Fire Brigade. Then she organized a human chain to pass buckets of water from the river. Then, with the fire burning above her, she directed the removal of the castle's most valuable contents out onto the lawn. 16. Running a fire evacuation in a 14th century castle while her brothers were fighting in France. That's who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was before anyone ever called her queen. And while she was putting out fires at home, literally, her brothers were in the trenches. Patrick had been wounded. John had been wounded. Michael was still fighting. And Fergus, Captain Fergus Bowes-Lyon, 8th Battalion, Black Watch, was about to lead his men into the worst battle of his life. September 27, 1915. The Battle of Loos. Her brother Fergus led his men forward into the German lines at a position called the Hohenzollern Redoubt. He didn't come back. Fergus Bowes-Lyon was 26 years old. He'd married Lady Christina Nora Dawson-Damer just a fortnight after the war started, September 17, 1914. A rushed wedding, the kind that happened all over Britain that autumn, young couples grabbing whatever time they had before the men shipped out. Christina was 24. They had less than a year together before Fergus was sent to the Western Front. On July 18, 1915, while Fergus was somewhere in France, Christina gave birth to their daughter. They named her Rosemary. Fergus never held her. He'd had one brief visit home in August, a few days of leave before returning to his battalion, but by then the British Army was preparing for its next major offensive, and there was no time. The Battle of Loos began on September 25, 1915. It was the largest British offensive of the war to that point, 6 divisions attacking along a front in northern France, trying to break through the German lines in Artois. Fergus was with the 8th Battalion, Black Watch. His Batman, his personal attendant, was a soldier named Alfred Anderson, who would eventually become the last surviving Scottish veteran of the entire First World War. On September 27th, the attack moved to the Hohenzollern Redoubt, a heavily fortified German position, a nightmare of trenches, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. Fergus led his men forward. A barrage of German artillery hit them. His leg was blown off. He fell backward into his sergeant's arms. Then bullets struck him in the chest and shoulder. He died on the field. 26 years old. A father for 2 months. A husband for just over a year. His body was buried in a quarry near Vermelles, France. The quarry was later designated a war cemetery. But in the chaos of the battle and its aftermath, the exact details of Fergus's grave were lost. His name was recorded on the Loos Memorial, the monument listing soldiers whose remains were never formally identified. Eventually, a headstone was placed at Quarry Cemetery. It doesn't say, "Here lies Captain Fergus Bowes-Lyon." It says, "Buried near this spot." Near this spot, not here, near here, somewhere close, probably. The family couldn't even grieve at the right piece of ground. That uncertainty haunted them for nearly a century. In 2011, 96 years after Fergus died, Queen Elizabeth II herself spoke publicly about the family's ongoing search for his remains. She met with Ministry of Defense officials who help families locate the bodies of soldiers lost in the First World War. Fergus's grandson, James Voysey Cecil, had been working with historians and with Prince Charles to track down the suspected mass grave. 96 years. 3 generations of a family still looking for a body buried somewhere near a quarry in France. Back at Glamis in 1915, the news hit like a bomb. Elizabeth's mother, Cecilia, didn't just grieve. She collapsed. The loss of Fergus broke something in her that never fully repaired. She became an invalid, physically present but emotionally unreachable. She withdrew from public life, from social obligations, from everything outside the walls of the castle. For 8 years, the woman who'd raised 10 children and run 2 estates essentially disappeared into her own grief. She didn't re-emerge, not really, not visibly, until 1923, when Elizabeth married Prince Albert at Westminster Abbey. That wedding was the thing that finally pulled Cecilia back into the world. 8 years. That's how long a mother's grief lasted when it wasn't allowed to be spoken about, when there was no language for it, when the expectation was that you carried on, because carrying on was what people like the Bowes-Lyons did. Elizabeth was 15 when Fergus died. She was living in a castle that had become a hospital. She was nursing wounded strangers through their worst hours. Her mother had gone silent. Her brother was dead in a quarry she'd never visit, and there was no one telling her it was okay to fall apart, because falling apart wasn't something the Bowes-Lyons did. Not visibly, not publicly, not ever. That lesson, grief is private, service is public, you carry it and you don't show it, she learned it at 15, and she never unlearned it. And the war wasn't done with the Bowes-Lyon family. 2 years later, another brother vanished. April 28, 1917. Michael Bowes-Lyon, the brother they called Mickey, a lieutenant in the Royal Scots, was reported missing in action. Missing. Not dead, not wounded. Missing. Which in 1917 meant one of three things. He'd been killed and his body hadn't been found. He'd been wounded and was lying in a field hospital somewhere without identification. Or he'd been captured. The family had no way of knowing which. 3 weeks of silence. 21 days without a word. In a house already shattered by Fergus's death 2 years earlier, already watching Cecilia fade deeper into grief with every passing month, the family sat and waited. Elizabeth was 16. She was still working in the hospital, still writing letters for men who couldn't hold a pen, still playing cards with soldiers who were trying not to think about what had happened to them, and now she was doing all of that while not knowing if her brother was alive. 3 weeks later, word finally came. Michael had been wounded and captured. He was being held in a German prisoner of war camp at Holzminden. He was alive. He would stay in that camp for the rest of the war. He survived. He came home. He lived until 1953. But the 3 weeks of not knowing, of sitting in silence while the war ground on outside and wounded men filled every room of the castle, that left something. In the family. In Elizabeth. The experience of waiting for a telegram that might say your brother is dead, after you've already received one that said exactly that, doesn't leave you when the waiting ends. It stays. The family gave 4 sons to the war. 1 was killed. 1 was captured. The other 2, Patrick and John, were both wounded at various points. 4 brothers, all of them damaged, 1 of them gone. Elizabeth spent those years doing the only thing she could do. She showed up. She wrote the letters, she played the cards, she bought the tobacco, she organized the fire evacuation, she held the castle together while her family came apart around her. She was 14 when it started and 18 when it ended, and then, November 11th, 1918, the armistice. The guns stopped, the last soldiers left Glamis. The castle was quiet again for the first time in 4 years. Elizabeth was 18. She'd spent her entire adolescence inside a war. She'd never had the normal years, the dances, the social season, the frivolous years that girls of her class were supposed to have. She'd gone straight from childhood to a wartime hospital and come out the other side older than her age, steadier than she should have been, and carrying things she didn't talk about. Now finally she could step into the world. She attended her coming out party in 1919, the formal debut into society that marked a young woman as eligible for courtship. She went to dances, met young men, entered the social season she'd been denied by 4 years of war. And there was Charles Gordon-Lennox, Lord Settrington. He was 20 years old, the eldest son of the 8th Duke of Richmond, heir to 3 dukedoms. His sister, Lady Doris Gordon-Lennox, was one of Elizabeth's closest friends, and it was through Doris that Elizabeth and Charlie had become close. He was, by every account that survives, extraordinary. Funny, direct, careless with convention. Elizabeth wrote that he always said what he thought, and coming from a girl who'd grown up in a world where nobody said what they thought, where everything was politeness and protocol and saying the right thing at the right time, that quality hit her like fresh air. He was the first person she'd ever loved, and what made him different, what made the loss of him so specific, so permanent, was the thing she said about him that she never said about anyone else. I was not shy about him. 5 words. And for Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a woman who would spend the next 80 years of her life being watched, performing, managing how she was seen. The fact that there was one person in front of whom she didn't perform, one person she was simply herself with, is the detail that breaks your heart. Charlie had survived the entire war. He'd been in the Irish Guards. He'd fought on the Western Front. In April 1918, during the Battle of Hazebrouck, he'd been captured by the Germans. He'd spent months as a prisoner in Karlsruhe. When the armistice came, he was released. He came home to England in December 1918. He was alive. The war was over. And then he got bored. There's no gentler way to put it. Civilian life didn't fit him. The quiet afternoons, the social calendar, the country house weekends. After years in the trenches and months in a prison camp, he couldn't sit still. So when the British government decided to intervene in the Russian Civil War, sending troops to support the White Russian forces against the Bolsheviks, Charlie volunteered. He joined the 45th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers and shipped out to North Russia. He wasn't drafted, he wasn't ordered. He chose to go. On August 24, 1919, at Bereznik in Severnaya Oblast, Charlie died of wounds sustained in action. He was 20 years old. He was buried in the Archangel Allied Cemetery in Arkhangelsk, Russia, a place so remote from England that Elizabeth would never visit his grave. When she got the news, she wrote the letter that opens this story. It's terrible, and his family just adored him. He was completely unique and always said what he thought. Charlie was the only one I could talk to in a completely natural and simple way. He was dear to me, and I miss him very much. She called him my only true friend. She was 19. She'd lost a brother at 15 and a first love at 19, both to the same war, a war that had technically ended 9 months before Charlie died. The armistice had come and gone, the guns were silent, and the war still took him. She never spoke about Charlie publicly again, not in interviews, not in her later years when biographers came asking. The letter survives because letters survive, but Elizabeth's silence about him, for the next 83 years of her life, is its own kind of grief, the kind that doesn't shrink, the kind that gets folded up and put away in a drawer, and the drawer stays shut. And then a shy prince arrived at Glamis. He could barely get a sentence out without stumbling over his own tongue. He was the second son of the King of England, and he looked at Elizabeth like she was the only person in the room. He proposed. She said no. Prince Albert, the family called him Bertie, was the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. He was 25 when he first proposed, 27 when Elizabeth finally accepted. He was earnest, loyal, physically brave. He'd served at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and completely undone by a stammer that had plagued him since childhood. The stammer was brutal. It wasn't a slight hesitation or a gentle catch on certain words. It was a full, visible, physical struggle, his jaw locking, his face contorting, the words refusing to come. It had been there since he was 4 or 5 years old. Some accounts trace it to the verbal abuse he'd received from his father, George V, who had little patience for a son who couldn't speak fluently. Others connect it to the fact that Bertie was naturally left-handed and had been forced, as was common practice at the time, to write with his right hand. Whatever the cause, it was the defining burden of his life. He met Elizabeth through social circles connected to the military, the kind of overlapping aristocratic world where everyone knew everyone, and introductions happened at country house weekends and dances. He fell in love with her immediately. That's not an exaggeration. People who were there, people who knew him, all said the same thing. He saw her and that was it. In 1921, he proposed for the first time. Elizabeth turned him down. Her reason tells you everything about who she was and what she'd already been through. She told friends she was afraid never, never again, to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. Never again to be free. She was 20 years old. She'd spent 4 years watching duty destroy people. Brothers killed, captured, wounded. She'd watched her mother consumed by obligation to grief, silent for years. She'd lost the one person she didn't have to perform for, and now a prince was offering her a crown she hadn't asked for, a life she hadn't chosen, and the guarantee that from that moment on, every word she spoke, every dress she wore, every smile she gave would belong to the institution, not to her. She said no. Bertie proposed again. She said no again. He went to his mother, Queen Mary, and told her something that was either romantic or obsessive, depending on your reading. He would marry no other woman. Elizabeth or nobody. Queen Mary, formidable, tall, dripping with diamonds and protocol, was intrigued enough to travel to Glamis Castle herself to see this girl who'd turned down her son twice. What Mary saw, or what Elizabeth showed her, was enough. The visit went well. The family approved. Bertie proposed a third time. This time, Elizabeth said yes. Not because the pressure worked. Not because she was dazzled by the crown. She said yes because she loved him. That was never in doubt. Not from the people who knew them, not from her own words in later years. She loved Bertie. The stammer, the shyness, the earnestness that other women might have found dull. She loved all of it. But she also knew what she was giving up. She'd said it herself. Never again to be free. They married on April 26, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth was 22. Bertie was 27. There's a detail about that day that nobody makes enough of. Elizabeth's mother, Cecilia, attended the wedding. It was her first significant public appearance since Fergus's death 8 years earlier. The wedding of her daughter was the thing that finally pulled her out of the grief that had consumed her since 1915. 8 years. That's how long it took. And what pulled her out wasn't therapy, wasn't medication, wasn't time. It was watching her daughter walk down the aisle. The joy of one child strong enough, just barely, to outweigh the grief of losing another. For 13 years after the wedding, Elizabeth got exactly what she'd hoped for: a quiet life, a husband she loved, 2 daughters, Elizabeth, born in 1926, and Margaret, born in 1930 at Glamis Castle. A home at 145 Piccadilly in London, later at White Lodge in Richmond Park. The Duke and Duchess of York, that was their title, and it suited them perfectly. Second in line, out of the spotlight, free, or as free as a member of the royal family could ever be. She spent those years doing something nobody outside the family knew about at the time. She was helping Bertie with his stammer. She'd found Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist based in London, a man with unconventional methods and no patience for royal protocol. Elizabeth brought them together. She sat in the room during sessions. She practiced with Bertie at home. She was the reason Logue and the future king ever met. The relationship between Logue and Bertie would eventually be dramatized in The King's Speech, the 2010 film with Colin Firth. But that film couldn't be made while the Queen Mother was alive. The family considered the stammer too private, too painful. Elizabeth herself described it with 2 words that carry more weight than any clinical diagnosis: dreadfully painful. Those 13 years, 1923 to 1936, were the only truly peaceful years Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon would ever have. She didn't know it then. She didn't know that a phone call was coming, that a crisis was building in the background, that her brother-in-law was about to make a choice so selfish it would change the course of her life and, she believed, eventually kill her husband. But it was coming, and it came on December 11th, 1936, the day Edward chose Wallace. The day Bertie became king, and the day Elizabeth lost the quiet life she'd spent 13 years building, permanently, irreversibly, and without anyone asking if she wanted it. Elizabeth and Bertie settled into a life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what she'd been afraid of losing when she said no to him twice. And yet, somehow, it wasn't. They lived first at White Lodge in Richmond Park, then moved to 145 Piccadilly, a townhouse in central London that would become the home Elizabeth II remembered as her actual childhood house, the one she talked about decades later with real affection. Princess Elizabeth was born on April 21, 1926, at her maternal grandparents' house in Mayfair. 4 years later, on August 5, 1930, Princess Margaret was born, at Glamis Castle, in the same building where Elizabeth had once nursed wounded soldiers, in the same building where the telegram about Fergus had once arrived. 2 daughters, a husband who loved her completely, a title, Duchess of York, that came with status but not the crushing weight of the crown itself. They were second in line, comfortably distant from the throne, with every reason to believe they'd stay that way. Bertie's older brother Edward was the Prince of Wales, unmarried but expected to eventually produce his own heirs. The York family could live their lives quietly, out of the main spotlight, doing minor royal duties and raising their girls. But there was one problem Elizabeth hadn't married her way out of: the stammer. It wasn't a minor thing. It wasn't a slight hesitation that added charm to his sentences. It was severe, his jaw locking mid-word, his face straining, sometimes minutes passing while he fought to get out a single syllable. In an era when royal duties increasingly meant public speaking, radio broadcasts, formal addresses, Bertie's stammer wasn't just embarrassing. It was a liability to the entire institution. The worst moment came in 1925, at the closing ceremony of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Stadium. Bertie had to deliver a speech to a massive crowd, broadcast live. He struggled through it. Long pauses, visible strain, the kind of public stumbling that made newspapers the next day and made grown men in the audience wince with secondhand embarrassment for him. It was humiliating, and Elizabeth watched every second of it. She decided something had to change, not for the sake of royal appearances, though that mattered too, but because she could see what the stammer was doing to her husband internally. The shame, the dread that built before every public appearance, the way it ate at his confidence in every part of his life, not just the podium. She found Lionel Logue. Logue was an Australian, not a doctor, not a credentialed physician, but a speech and language therapist, with unconventional methods and zero interest in royal deference. He'd worked with shell-shocked soldiers returning from the war, men who'd lost their ability to speak clearly after the trauma of combat. His techniques were physical, breathing-based, and deeply personal. Nothing like the stiff, formal treatment a royal patient might expect. Elizabeth arranged the introduction. She sat in on sessions. She practiced exercises with Bertie at home, between appointments, in private, where nobody could see him struggling and where he didn't have to perform strength he didn't feel. Logue's own diaries, kept privately throughout his life and only published decades later, described the vital role Elizabeth played in bringing the two men together and in sustaining the relationship that followed. It wasn't a one-time referral, it was years of quiet, consistent work, mostly invisible to the public, mostly unrecognized at the time. The relationship between Logue and Bertie would eventually become one of the most famous stories in royal history, dramatized in the 2010 film The King's Speech, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. But here's something worth sitting with. That film could not have been made while the Queen Mother was alive. The family considered the stammer and everything around it too private, too painful to be turned into public entertainment while she was still living. Elizabeth herself, in her own words, called it dreadfully painful. 2 words. Not difficult, not challenging, dreadfully painful. That's how she described watching the man she loved fight his own body in front of the world, year after year. But between 1923 and 1936, this was manageable. It was private. It was a problem being solved quietly, at home, away from constant public exposure. The girls were growing up. Bertie's confidence was slowly improving. Elizabeth had built exactly the life she'd been afraid to lose. Steady, warm, largely out of the spotlight, held together by her own quiet determination. These 13 years were the only truly peaceful stretch of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's entire life. Before them, war, death, loss, a mother's collapse, a first love buried in Russia. After them, a crisis that would take everything she'd built and detonate it in a single winter. She didn't know it yet, nobody did. But on January 20th, 1936, King George V died, and Elizabeth's peaceful life had exactly 11 months left. Edward, Prince of Wales, became King Edward the Fees the moment his father died. He was charming, modern, popular with the public, and he was obsessed with an American woman named Wallis Simpson, who was, at that point, on her second marriage, with her first husband still living. The British establishment was not prepared to accept this. The Church of England, of which the king was the supreme governor, did not recognize divorce as grounds for remarriage while a former spouse was alive. The cabinet, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, made it clear that a marriage to Wallis Simpson was politically untenable. The Dominion governments across the Commonwealth echoed the same position. Edward had a choice: give up Wallis or give up the throne. He chose Wallis. On December 11, 1936, less than a year after becoming king, Edward the Feege abdicated. In a radio broadcast heard around the world, he explained that he'd found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. It was framed, at the time and ever since, as one of the great romantic gestures of the 20th century. A king who gave up an empire for love. Elizabeth didn't see it that way, not for 1 second. She was furious, not sad, furious, because she understood something that most of the public, swept up in the romance of the story, didn't fully grasp. Bertie wasn't built for this. He'd spent his entire life as the second son, trained for a supporting role, never groomed for the top job. He had a stammer that made public speaking an ordeal. He was shy, anxious, and deeply uncomfortable with the exact kind of exposure the throne demanded. And now, because his older brother wanted a woman the establishment wouldn't accept, the entire weight of the British monarchy was being dropped onto Bertie's shoulders, a job he'd never wanted, never trained for, and was, in Elizabeth's eyes, being forced into by his brother's selfishness. There's a story from before the abdication, during Edward's brief reign, that captures exactly how Elizabeth felt about the woman at the center of it. Elizabeth visited Balmoral Castle, where Edward and Wallis were staying. When Wallis came to greet her before dinner, Elizabeth walked straight past her, offering nothing, no handshake, no acknowledgement, and said only, "I came to dine with the king." Not "I came to dine with you both," not even eye contact by most accounts. A dismissal delivered in 6 words, cold enough to freeze the room. That coldness never thawed. Elizabeth lived another 66 years after the abdication. She never forgave Edward. She never forgave Wallis. Not privately, not publicly, not even as decades passed and the scandal faded into history for everyone else. For Elizabeth, it never faded. It calcified into something permanent. On December 11, 1936, Bertie became King George VI. Elizabeth became Queen Consort. The coronation took place on May 12, 1937, at Westminster Abbey. the same building where they'd married 14 years earlier, in what was supposed to have been the last major ceremony either of them would ever be at the center of. Their daughters, 11-year-old Elizabeth and 6-year-old Margaret, watched from the royal gallery as their parents were crowned. Two little girls, suddenly heirs to a throne nobody in the family had expected them to inherit, watching their father accept a crown that was visibly, physically difficult for him to even speak about. Elizabeth carried a belief for the rest of her life, one she never publicly softened or walked back, that the stress of kingship killed her husband, that every cigarette George smoked to steady his nerves before a speech, every sleepless night before a public appearance, every ounce of pressure that came with a job he'd never wanted, all of it, ultimately, traced back to Edward's decision to choose Wallace Simpson over the crown. She believed Edward's selfishness cost her husband his life, and she held on to that belief with the same intensity she'd held on to her grief for Fergus and for Charlie, quietly, permanently, without ever asking the public to carry it with her. Within 2 years of the coronation, those stammered speeches Elizabeth had worked so hard to help Bertie manage would matter more than anyone in that abbey could have predicted, because the bombs were coming, and the voice of a king who could barely get through a sentence would soon be the only thing standing between a terrified nation and total collapse of morale. September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and that same evening, King George VI had to address the entire nation by live radio. This wasn't the private struggle of the 1925 Wembley speech, watched by a stadium crowd and reported the next morning in newspapers. This was live radio, broadcast simultaneously across Britain and the Commonwealth, with millions of people huddled around their sets in the exact moment war was declared. Desperate for reassurance, desperate for a voice that could tell them everything would be all right. And that voice belonged to a man whose jaw could lock mid-sentence without warning. Lionel Logue was there. He'd been at George's side for major speeches for years by this point, and he continued to be, present in the room during preparation, coaching him through the physical techniques that helped control the stammer, staying close enough during the actual broadcast that George could see him and draw some steadiness from his presence. Elizabeth was there too. Every single time. She'd been in the room for the private sessions years earlier, when this was a manageable problem being solved quietly at home. Now she sat through broadcasts where the entire war effort's morale hinged, in some small but real way, on whether her husband could get through his own sentences without breaking down in front of the world. The September 1939 declaration of war broadcast, then the Christmas message that December, the King's Christmas broadcast, had become a beloved national tradition since his father George V started it, and now George VI had to carry it forward, live, unedited, every single word a potential trap. Think about what that actually meant, technically. This wasn't like a modern broadcast where mistakes get edited out, where a difficult take gets recorded again. This was live radio, one shot. If the stammer seized him mid-sentence, if his jaw locked on a word in front of millions of listeners who were relying on him for stability during the most frightening period of their lives, there was no fixing it. It happened, in real time, in front of the entire country, or it didn't. Elizabeth watched every one of these broadcasts. She knew exactly what each one cost him. She'd been there for the shame after Wembley in 1925. She'd found Logue. She'd sat through years of private practice sessions, coaxing her husband through an affliction that had nothing to do with his intelligence or his character, and everything to do with a physical betrayal his own body inflicted on him at the worst possible moments. And now she watched it happen on a national stage, with the stakes raised to their absolute maximum. A king who'd never wanted the throne, forced into it by his brother's choice, fighting his own voice on live radio while an entire nation waited to see if he could hold together long enough to hold them together. He got through it. Broadcast after broadcast, year after year, he got through it. Imperfectly, painfully, but he got through it. Elizabeth knew what each one cost him privately, even as the country only ever saw the result. A king who spoke haltingly but spoke, who stood at the microphone and refused to be silent, no matter what his own body tried to do to him. But while George fought his private war against his own voice in the broadcasting room, an entirely different war was arriving outside. The Luftwaffe was coming for London, and Elizabeth was about to make a decision, one delivered in a single defiant sentence, that would define how an entire nation remembered her for the rest of the century. When war broke out, the British cabinet formally advised that the two princesses, Elizabeth, 13, and Margaret, 9, be evacuated to Canada, out of reach of German bombers, joining thousands of other British children being sent overseas for safety. Elizabeth's response became one of the most quoted sentences in British wartime history. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." 3 sentences. Total refusal, at every level. The girls wouldn't leave without their mother. She wouldn't leave without her husband. And her husband, the reluctant king, the one who'd never asked for any of this, would never abandon London no matter what came from the sky. If you're finding this story as heavy as I did putting it together, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories the right way. Now let's keep going because it only gets harder from here. The princesses were moved to Windsor Castle in 1940, spending most of the war years there, putting on pantomimes to entertain staff, living a strange, contained version of childhood behind castle walls while the world outside burned. But the king and queen stayed in London, officially residing at Buckingham Palace, spending nights at Windsor with their daughters when they could. On September 13, 1940, during the height of the Blitz, the Luftwaffe hit Buckingham Palace directly. 5 high-explosive bombs. The king and queen were inside at the time. They survived, and Elizabeth's reaction to nearly being killed in her own home wasn't fear or fury. It was something closer to relief. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she said. "Now I can look the East End in the face." That sentence needs context to land properly. The East End of London, the Docklands, the working-class neighborhoods nearest the Thames, was being devastated nightly by German bombing raids, far worse and far more sustained than what Buckingham Palace had just experienced. And when the king and queen had gone to tour the wreckage there to show solidarity with the families who'd lost everything, the reception had not been warm. Crowds had jeered. Rubbish had been thrown. There was open hostility toward a queen who arrived in expensive clothes to survey the ruins of people who had nothing left. It wasn't unreasonable resentment, it was the visible gap between a monarch's comfort and a working family's devastation, on full display. Elizabeth understood the problem immediately, and her solution revealed exactly how she thought. She reasoned that if the public dressed in their best clothes to come see her, she owed them the same effort in return, not the sackcloth of false humility, but genuine respect, delivered through care in her appearance. Her designer, Norman Hartnell, dressed her in soft pastel colors instead of black mourning wear. He called the look the rainbow of hope. She kept showing up, week after week, to bombed-out streets, to hospitals, to factories running double shifts for the war effort. Slowly, not all at once, not without resistance, the hostility in the East End began to shift. The people who'd once thrown rubbish started waiting for her instead. Buckingham Palace was hit 9 times over the course of the war, 9 separate bombings. Elizabeth didn't leave after any of them. Adolf Hitler reportedly called her the most dangerous woman in Europe. It was intended as an insult, a jab at how effectively she was rallying British morale simply by refusing to be intimidated. Elizabeth, by every account, took it as one of the highest compliments of her life. The war ground on for years, factory visits, hospital tours, walking through bomb sites with families who'd lost their homes, sometimes their entire street, sometimes people they loved. It wasn't glamorous work, and it wasn't occasional, it was constant, grinding year after year, the kind of endurance that doesn't make for exciting headlines, but that slowly, cumulatively, builds a bond between a monarch and a public that no single dramatic gesture ever could. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe was over. The royal family appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony to enormous crowds. The same balcony, the same building that had been hit 9 times, still standing, still occupied by the family that had refused to leave it. And in one of the most human moments of the entire war, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret slipped out of the palace that night and mingled anonymously with the celebrating crowds in the streets of London. 2 princesses, briefly and secretly, just 2 young women celebrating the end of the war like everyone else, unrecognized, unguarded, free for a few hours in a way they rarely got to be. The country celebrated, the war was won. Elizabeth had held her family together through 6 years of bombing, 6 years of her husband's stammer under the worst possible pressure, 6 years of factory visits and hospital tours and walking through rubble in pastel dresses because she believed that's what dignity required of her. But behind the celebration on that balcony, something else was becoming visible, something Elizabeth had likely been watching for years, even as the public celebrated. George's health was deteriorating. The stress of 6 years of wartime leadership, the strain of every broadcast, the years of unrelenting pressure on a man who'd never wanted this life in the first place, it was taking a physical toll that no victory parade could reverse. He was a heavy smoker, as most men of his generation were, and the habit had only intensified under the strain of the war years. He looked older than his years. He looked tired in a way that went beyond ordinary fatigue. The war was won, but the man who'd helped win it, the reluctant king who'd fought through every stammered broadcast, who'd stayed in London through 9 bombings, who'd never once complained publicly about a job he'd never asked for, was dying. And Elizabeth, who'd spent over a decade learning to read every flicker of strain on her husband's face, likely knew it before anyone else did. George's health had been failing for longer than the public understood. He was a heavy smoker, as most men of his generation were, and by the late 1940s the habit that had helped him steady his nerves through years of stammering broadcasts was quietly destroying his lungs. By 1951, the illness had progressed to lung cancer. That September, surgeons removed his left lung entirely. The surgery was described publicly in vague, reassuring terms. Behind the scenes, it was serious. George appeared at public events afterward looking visibly diminished, thinner, older than his years, his voice weaker than it had been even at its most halting during the war. Elizabeth watched this happen the way she'd watched everything else in her life, day by day, without complaint, without ever suggesting to the public that anything was wrong. By early 1952, George was 56 years old and dying, though the full severity may not have been spelled out to him in the blunt terms doctors would use today. On February 5th, he spent the day at Sandringham House doing something he loved, shooting on the estate grounds, out in the cold air, doing his best to live like a man who wasn't sick. That evening, he had his usual routine. A valet brought him his cocoa. He read for a while, then he went to sleep. He never woke up. Sometime in the early hours of February 6, 1952, George VI died in his sleep. He was 56 years old. He and Elizabeth had been married for 29 years. She was 51. The news reached the outside world in stages, the way news traveled in 1952. A call to the palace, a call to the government, a formal announcement that stopped the country in its tracks. Princess Elizabeth, in Kenya at the time on a Commonwealth tour, became queen the moment her father died, though she wouldn't return to British soil and formally begin her reign for several more days. For Elizabeth, the widow now known as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title created specifically to distinguish her from her daughter, the new Queen Elizabeth II, the loss was total. She'd spent 29 years with this man. She'd found him a speech therapist. She'd sat through every broadcast, every public appearance, every moment where his own body threatened to betray him in front of the nation. She'd watched him hold a country together through the worst war in its history, using a voice that had once been mocked and dismissed as unfit for a king. More than 300,000 people filed past his coffin as it lay in state at Westminster Hall. Long lines stretched through London, ordinary citizens waiting for hours in February cold to pay their respects to the reluctant king who'd never wanted the job and had done it anyway, through 6 years of war, through a stammer that never fully disappeared, through a burden his own brother had dropped on him without asking if he wanted it. And Elizabeth, the woman who had refused to leave London during the Blitz, who had walked through bombed-out streets in pastel colors while the Luftwaffe targeted her own home, who had told the cabinet flatly that her children would not go to Canada without her, retreated to Scotland and disappeared. She wore black, nothing but black, for an entire year. She withdrew almost completely from public life. The woman who had been the most dangerous woman in Europe, according to Hitler himself, the woman who had refused to be intimidated by 9 separate bombings of her own home, went silent. For a year there was no rainbow of hope. There was no pastel dress designed to reassure a grieving public. There was just Elizabeth, alone with her grief, doing something she had never once allowed herself to do publicly in 37 years of adult life, falling apart, quietly, out of sight, where nobody could see what losing George had actually done to her. It took Winston Churchill, the same man who had led Britain through the war her husband's voice had helped hold together, to bring her back. Churchill understood grief. He understood duty. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it meant to carry a nation's morale on your shoulders while your own private world was falling apart. He went to Elizabeth and made the case that the country still needed her, that her daughter, thrust into the crown far earlier than anyone had expected, still needed her. She came back. She took up residence at Clarence House, near Buckingham Palace, a home that would remain hers for the rest of her life. And she did something else, something that tells you exactly how she processed grief when the performing was over and she was alone with it. She bought the Castle of May. It was a crumbling, half-abandoned estate in the far northeast of Scotland, on the very edge of the country, about as far from London and its cameras and its expectations as she could get while remaining in Britain. She bought it in 1952, the same year George died, and she restored it herself, not as a monument, not as a museum, but as a working home, a place with gardens she planted, and animals she kept, and rooms she actually lived in. It became the place she went when the public performance became too much. When the grief that she never spoke about in interviews, never explained to biographers, never once turned into a tell-all confession, needed somewhere private to exist. The Castle of May wasn't for the cameras. It was for her. She rebuilt her public life from there. She returned to London, to Clarence House, to a schedule of public engagements that would eventually become almost inconceivable for a woman her age. She made well over 100 public appearances a year, well into her 90s. She smiled. She waved. She showed up to openings and galas and hospital visits and military reviews, decade after decade, the same pattern she'd established after every loss in her life: grieve privately, then serve publicly, and never let the two overlap where the public could see. But during those 50 years of widowhood, the longest chapter of her life, longer than her marriage, longer than her childhood, longer than any other single period, there was something happening that had nothing to do with public appearances or pastel dresses or gin and tonics on the balcony. It involved two girls, her own nieces. And what happened to them, and what Elizabeth may or may not have known about it, is the part of this story that, when it finally came to light, shocked the entire country. Elizabeth's brother John Herbert Bowes-Lyon had married a woman named Fenella. Together they had 4 daughters. 2 of them, Nerissa, born in 1919, and Catherine, born in 1926, were born with severe developmental disabilities. Neither girl ever learned to speak beyond a few basic words. Their mental age, as it was assessed at the time, was somewhere between 3 and 6 years old, regardless of their actual physical age. John died of pneumonia in 1930. He was 43 years old. Fenella was left alone to raise 4 young daughters, 2 of whom required constant specialized care that a single mother in the 1930s had almost no resources or support to provide. For 11 years she managed. Somehow, on her own, she kept the family together and kept Nerissa and Catherine cared for at home or in specialized schooling designed for disabled children of aristocratic families. Then, in June 1941, Fenella made a decision. Nerissa, 22 years old, and Catherine, 15, were admitted to the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives in Red Hill, Surrey. The name of the place tells you everything about how the era understood, or failed to understand, developmental disability. It had previously been called the Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. By 1941, it had been renamed, but the underlying classification system hadn't changed much. The girls were diagnosed, in the medical language of the time, as imbeciles, and on that same day, the exact same day, Fenella's sister Harriet had her own 3 daughters, Edonia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary Fane, admitted to the identical institution. All 5 girls from 2 branches of the same extended family shared the same underlying genetic condition, later traced to the Hepburn-Stewart-Forbes-Trefusis line on their mother's side, not the Bowes-Lyon side. 5 girls, 1 day, 1 institution. A single, coordinated decision by 2 sisters to place their disabled daughters into the same facility at the same time, a decision that, whatever the intentions behind it, effectively erased them from the visible life of 2 aristocratic families connected, however distantly, to the British throne. What life looked like inside Earlswood for these girls is difficult to fully reconstruct. It was a state-funded institution, understaffed and underfunded even by the standards of 1940s mental health care, built for hundreds of patients with a range of conditions and disabilities, offering little in the way of individualized attention or modern therapeutic approaches. Care, in this context, meant custody. It meant containment. It meant these girls would live out their entire lives inside a building that most of British society had agreed, silently, not to think about. And then someone made a decision that turned institutional neglect into something closer to erasure. The girls were declared dead, officially, in print, in the definitive record of British aristocratic lineage. Their names were removed from the world the same way their bodies had already been removed from public view. By 1963, when the definitive edition of Burke's Peerage, the authoritative record of British aristocratic families, was published, it listed Nerissa Bowes-Lyon as having died in 1940. It listed Catherine as having died in 1961. Neither of these dates was true. Both women were alive. Both were still inside Royal Earlswood, exactly where they had been placed 22 years earlier. Nerissa actually died in 1986, 26 years after her official recorded death date. She was 66 years old. No member of the Bowes-Lyon family attended her funeral. She was buried at Redstone Cemetery near Earlswood in a pauper's grave, marked not with a headstone bearing her name and her connection to one of Britain's most prominent families, but with a small plastic tag carrying a serial number. Catherine was still alive. Nobody outside a small circle knew it. In 1987, the truth surfaced. The Daily Express uncovered the real story, that Nerissa had died only the year before, not decades earlier as the official record claimed, and that her sister Catherine was still living, at that point 61 years old, still inside the institution where she'd been placed as a 15-year-old girl in 1941. A photographer working for the Sun posed as a relative in order to gain access to Catherine's ward. The photograph that resulted appeared on the front page, a frail, confused elderly woman, 46 years institutionalized, staring at a camera she likely didn't understand was there. When journalists asked Buckingham Palace to comment on the revelation that the Queen Mother's own nieces had been hidden away and falsely declared dead for decades, the palace's response was 5 words long. It is a matter for the Bowes-Lyon family. In 2011, Channel 4 broadcast a documentary called The Queen's Hidden Cousins, drawing on testimony from nurses and fellow patients who had known the sisters during their decades at Earlswood. The documentary's conclusion was direct. Throughout their time at the hospital, there is no known record that the sisters were ever visited by any member of the Bowes-Lyon or royal families. Nurses interviewed for the film said the family never sent so much as a birthday card or a Christmas gift in all those years. No acknowledgement, no contact. Nothing. And here's the detail that makes the story impossible to fully untangle, that leaves it sitting in genuinely uncomfortable ambiguity rather than clean villainy. Throughout this entire period, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, served as a patron of MenCap, the United Kingdom's leading charity for people with learning disabilities. She spent decades publicly associated with the cause of dignified care for exactly the kind of condition her own nieces lived with, while, according to the documentary's account, having no recorded contact with those nieces at all. The family's defenders have pushed back hard against the narrative of deliberate cruelty. One account holds that Elizabeth didn't actually learn the whereabouts and situation of her nieces until 1982, more than 4 decades after they were institutionalized, and that once she found out, she began sending money to Earlswood on their behalf, described in various retellings as either a modest amount for sweets and small comforts, or a more substantial sum for Christmas and birthday gifts. Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, the sister's niece, responded at length to dispute the 2011 documentary's characterization of total family abandonment, offering a more complicated picture than the stark, no visits, no contact, no cards narrative the film presented. And there's the matter of Fenella herself, the mother who made the original decision. Her descendants have claimed she was, in their words, vague and notoriously careless with official paperwork and forms, which, they argue, could explain how 2 living women ended up with incorrect death dates in Burke's peerage without any conspiracy or deliberate deception behind it. Others have suggested a different explanation entirely, that the false death dates were a deliberate act, intended not to erase the girls out of shame, but to protect their privacy from a public and a press that, in that era, would have shown them no mercy at all. Whatever the truth, Catherine outlived her sister by 28 years. When Royal Earlswood finally closed its doors in 1997, she was moved to Ketwin House Care Home in Surrey, living out her final years alongside her cousin, Idonia Fane, one of the last 2 survivors of the 5 girls admitted on that single day back in 1941. Catherine died in 2014, at the age of 87. Whether Elizabeth knew everything about her niece's situation from the very beginning, knew only fragments passed along quietly through family channels, or genuinely knew nothing until 1982, as some accounts suggest, the weight of that secret sat somewhere inside the family for the better part of half a century, and it sat there alongside another grief Elizabeth was already carrying in real time, one that played out not in a locked institution far from public view, but directly in front of the entire British public, on the front page of every newspaper in the country. It involved her youngest daughter, and a love that the very institution Elizabeth had married into, the same institution that had once made her afraid to lose her freedom, refused, categorically, to let Margaret keep. After the Townsend engagement ended in 1955, Margaret spent the rest of that decade being watched by a country that couldn't decide whether to pity her or judge her. She was 25 years old, still glamorous, still the most talked about young royal in Britain, and now carrying a very public heartbreak that everyone had an opinion about. In 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a fashionable, talented photographer, not an aristocrat, not a royal, not the kind of man the family had traditionally chosen for its daughters. He was created Earl of Snowdon shortly after the wedding. For a while, it looked like a genuinely happy match. They had 2 children, David, later known as Viscount Linley, born in 1961, and Lady Sarah Chatto, born in 1964. But the marriage didn't hold. Both Margaret and Anthony had affairs. The relationship deteriorated through the 1960s and into the 1970s, playing out with increasing public visibility. In the mid-1970s, Margaret began a well-documented relationship with a much younger man named Roddy Llewellyn, a connection that generated exactly the kind of tabloid frenzy the family had spent decades trying to avoid. In 1978, Margaret and Anthony divorced. It was the first divorce inside the Queen's immediate family in the modern era. A full generation before Charles and Diana's split would make headlines. A full 2 decades before Sarah Ferguson and Andrew's own very public separation. Margaret had already lived through one failed royal romance that the institution destroyed. Now she'd lived through a marriage the institution hadn't been able to save either. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the pattern of Margaret's life became one of slow, visible decline. She was a heavy smoker, had been for decades, the same generational habit that had contributed to her father's death, and in 1985, part of her lung was removed as a direct result. She continued smoking anyway. Her health kept eroding. In February 1998, she suffered a stroke. In March 2001, she suffered another. There was an incident where she badly scalded her feet in a bathing accident, an injury that left her with lasting mobility problems and made even simple movement painful. By the early 2000s, she was frequently photographed in a wheelchair, visibly frail, a shadow of the sharp-witted, glamorous woman who'd once scandalized the country by brushing lint off Peter Townshend's jacket at her sister's coronation. The Queen Mother watched all of this happen to her youngest daughter. This wasn't a distant observation from a detached matriarch. Margaret was the daughter born at Glamis Castle in 1930, in the same building where the telegram about Fergus had once arrived. Margaret was the spirited one, the funny one, the daughter who'd once slipped out of Buckingham Palace on VE Day to celebrate anonymously in the crowds with her sister, 2 young princesses briefly indistinguishable from anyone else celebrating the end of the war. Now Elizabeth was watching that same daughter be taken apart, slowly, over decades, by illness, by smoking, by the accumulated weight of losses that had started when she was 21 years old and never really stopped. Royal biographer Anna Pasternak offered an analysis of Margaret's decline that reframes the entire story in a way worth sitting with. The popular narrative was always that Margaret never recovered from losing Townshend, the great forbidden love, the sacrifice of duty over desire, the wound that never healed. But Pasternak argued it's more accurate to say that Margaret never recovered from her father's death when she was 21. Think about what George VI's death actually took from Margaret, beyond the obvious grief of losing a parent. It took her father. It took her sister too, in a sense, because the moment George died, Elizabeth became queen, and the closeness of 2 sisters who'd grown up together, performed pantomimes together, slipped into VE Day crowds together, was permanently altered by an institutional distance that hadn't existed between them before. And the king's death was also the event that precipitated the entire Townshend crisis, because it was George's passing that put Elizabeth on the throne, made Margaret heiress presumptive, and placed her love affair under a level of institutional scrutiny it might never have faced otherwise. One loss, cascading into the next, into the next. Her father, her sister, in the way sisters change when one becomes queen, the freedom to marry the man she loved. Each grief compounding the last, none of them ever fully processed, all of them accumulating in a woman who, like her mother, had been raised to carry things quietly and keep performing regardless of what was happening underneath. And then, in February 2002, the call came. Margaret had suffered her final stroke. The Queen Mother, 101 years old, already physically frail, already fighting a chest infection she'd been battling since Christmas, was about to have to bury her own daughter. On February 9, 2002, Princess Margaret died peacefully in her sleep at King Edward VII Hospital. She was 71 years old. George Carey, who had served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 1991 to 2002, visited Margaret in her final hours. Years later, In a documentary reflecting on the House of Windsor, he described what he witnessed. "She was sad," he said. "There were moments when she expressed that sadness." He went further, offering an assessment that cuts straight to the heart of everything Margaret had carried for nearly 50 years. Here is a woman who longed for love and commitment, and the love of her life was forbidden from her, and there was a deep human sadness in that. Nearly 5 decades after she'd stood in front of the country and announced she was giving up Peter Townsend for duty, the former Archbishop of Canterbury sat beside her deathbed and recognized instantly what that renunciation had actually cost her. A few days after Margaret's death, the Queen Mother suffered a fall while alone in her sitting room. She cut her arm, she went into shock. She was 101 years old, already exhausted from months of illness, now grieving her youngest child, and now also physically injured from a fall that, at her age, could easily have been catastrophic on its own. Margaret's funeral was held on February 15, 2002, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The date carried a weight that felt almost too deliberate to be coincidence. It fell exactly 50 years to the day after the funeral of King George VI, the father whose death Pasternak had identified as the true origin point of everything Margaret never recovered from. The Queen Mother arrived by helicopter from Sandringham. She was too frail, too injured, too unwell to make the journey any other way. She sat in a wheelchair throughout the entire service, wearing a black coat, her arm still bandaged from the fall days earlier. 450 mourners filled the chapel. Margaret's coffin, draped in her personal standard, was covered in roses. Outside the castle gates, a crowd of nearly 3,000 people gathered, despite the private, low-key nature of the service inside. A woman named Jessie Evans, 79 years old, spoke to a reporter and captured, in a single sentence, exactly what everyone watching from outside those gates understood without needing it explained. "The one that makes me ache today a lot is the Queen Mother," she said. "She has had to come today to say goodbye to her daughter." 7 weeks later, on March 30th, 2002, Easter Saturday, the Queen Mother died peacefully in her sleep at Royal Lodge, Windsor. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was at her bedside. She was 101 years old. Prince Charles, who had been extraordinarily close to his grandmother throughout his life, was in Switzerland on a skiing holiday with his sons William and Harry when the news reached him. A royal spokesperson described the family as completely devastated. Charles and the boys cut their holiday short immediately and returned home. She was gone. The woman who had first learned to carry grief in silence at 15 years old, writing letters for wounded soldiers while her own brother lay dead in an unmarked grave in France, 87 years later, that same capacity for silent endurance had carried her through the death of a husband, the slow unraveling of a daughter, and finally, in her last weeks of life, through a funeral she had to attend in a wheelchair with a bandaged arm, because duty, even at 101, was still not optional. She had finally put the weight down, but what she left behind, the way she had carried it, the enormous personal cost of carrying it, the exact pattern she had built and repeated across nearly a century of loss, that didn't die with her. That pattern outlived her, in ways that would shape the woman who inherited it. Look at the pattern laid out across her entire life, and it becomes almost impossible not to see the shape of it, repeating itself with mechanical precision every single time. After Fergus died in 1915, 15-year-old Elizabeth went back to nursing wounded soldiers at Glamis, the very next day, the very same week. After Charlie died in 1919, 19-year-old Elizabeth eventually accepted Bertie's proposal and stepped into a life of formal duty. After the abdication crisis destroyed her quiet years in 1936, Elizabeth put on the crown and helped rebuild a shattered monarchy's public image. After Buckingham Palace was bombed in 1940, Elizabeth put on a pastel dress designed specifically to project hope and walked directly into the wreckage of the East End. After George died in 1952, Elizabeth wore black for exactly 1 year, and then, at Churchill's urging, came back to public life and never fully stopped again. After Margaret died in February 2002, 101-year-old Elizabeth got into a helicopter with a freshly bandaged arm and sat through her daughter's entire funeral in a wheelchair. Loss, silence, service, that was the pattern, repeated, with almost no variation, across 87 years of an extraordinarily long life. She built an armor for herself, layer by layer, loss by loss, and she wore it so consistently, for so long, that most of the world simply accepted it as her natural personality rather than recognizing it for what it actually was, a survival mechanism, constructed one grief at a time, starting when she was a teenager, writing letters for soldiers who couldn't hold a pen. The armor had specific, visible components. The gin and tonics, famously, reliably, part of daily life at Clarence House. The racehorses, she owned approximately 500 winners over the course of her lifetime, a genuine passion that had nothing to do with duty, and everything to do with pure enjoyment, one of the few places in her life that seemed to exist purely for her own pleasure. The Castle of May, the private retreat at the very edge of Scotland where she could exist, away from the public gaze that had followed her since childhood. The hats, the wave, the specific, practiced cheerfulness that greeted every crowd, every camera, every public engagement for over half a century. And the schedule itself was its own kind of armor. Well over 100 public appearances a year, sustained deep into her 90s, an output that would exhaust people decades younger. She served as patron or president of more than 300 separate organizations across her lifetime. This wasn't a woman coasting on inherited status. This was a woman who had decided, somewhere very early in her life, that visible, tireless service was the answer to grief that had no other acceptable outlet. What she never did, across the entire span of her extraordinarily long life, was talk about any of it. There was no memoir laying out the loss of Fergus, the loss of Charlie, the fury at Edward, the 50 years of missing George. There was no tell-all interview. There was no tearful sit-down where she explained, in her own words, what any of it had actually cost her. The letter about Charlie survives because letters survive on their own, independent of what she chose to share. Everything else, the internal cost, the private processing, the actual weight of 87 years of accumulated loss, she kept entirely to herself. Her staff knew, in the way that people who work closely with someone for decades come to understand things that are never explicitly said. Her closest friends understood that the relentless cheerfulness was a choice made fresh every single morning, not a personality trait she'd been born with. The smile that greeted every crowd was real, genuinely real, not performed in sincerity, but it sat on top of something enormous that she had decided, permanently, was never going to be named out loud. Her 100th birthday, on August 4th, 2000, captures this contradiction perfectly. 40,000 people gathered in the mall for the celebration. There was a parade featuring the comedian Norman Wisdom and the actor John Mills, celebrating highlights of her extraordinary life. She rode in a carriage up the mall to Buckingham Palace alongside her grandson, Prince Charles. She appeared on the palace balcony with both of her daughters standing beside her. At a lunch at the Guildhall that same year, the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, accidentally reached for her glass of wine, mistaking it for his own. Her response was immediate and sharp, "That's mine." The room dissolved into laughter. It became one of the most beloved, most widely repeated stories from her 100th year. A 100-year-old woman defending her wine glass from the Archbishop of Canterbury with perfect comic timing. A woman who had lived through a century that contained more compounded grief than most people experience across 5 separate lifetimes was, in that exact moment, laughing about a glass of wine in front of 40,000 well-wishers. That was Elizabeth. That was the entire pattern of her life, distilled into a single afternoon. The grief was real and it was enormous, and it never fully left her. And the laughter was also real, and the joy in that wineglass moment was also genuine. And somehow she had spent 87 years teaching herself to hold both of those truths at once, in public, without ever letting one collapse into the other. She didn't just carry her own grief this way, she set the template, a specific, repeatable pattern for how a woman in her position was supposed to survive loss after loss after loss, without ever showing the public the actual cost. And the woman who inherited that template most directly, who had watched her own mother carry 50 years of widowhood with exactly this pattern of loss, silence, and service, would go on to carry her own grief in almost precisely the same way. The pattern didn't end with the Queen Mother. It passed directly to her eldest daughter, the woman who had grown up watching her mother grieve in silence and had absorbed, without ever being explicitly taught, that this was simply how a queen was supposed to carry loss. Queen Elizabeth II's accession to the throne happened on February 6, 1952, the exact date her father died. For the rest of her life, every single year, the anniversary of the day she became queen was also the anniversary of the day she lost her father in his sleep at Sandringham. 70 years of that overlap. 70 years where the date that marked the beginning of her reign was inseparable from the date that marked the end of her father's life. She never celebrated it publicly. There was no annual address, no reflection given to the press, no moment where she spoke openly about what it meant to carry both a coronation anniversary and a father's death inside the same 24 hours, year after year, for 7 full decades. She marked it privately, the way her mother had marked almost everything that actually hurt, and the losses kept accumulating across her own extraordinarily long life, the same way they had accumulated across her mother's. Her father, George VI, in 1952, her sister Margaret in February 2002, her mother, the Queen Mother, 7 weeks later in March 2002, her husband, Prince Philip, who died in April 2021, after 73 years of marriage, a length of partnership that made George and Elizabeth's 29 years together look almost brief by comparison. All of it carried quietly. All of it processed the way the family had always processed grief, publicly composed, privately devastated, and never, under any circumstances, explained to the cameras. On March 30th, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II privately marked the 20th anniversary of her mother's death at Windsor Castle. The timing of that private remembrance carries its own weight. It came the day after she had attended the public memorial service for Prince Philip, her husband of 73 years, held at Westminster Abbey. 2 griefs, back to back, one public and enormous, one private and quiet, handled within 24 hours of each other by a monarch who was, by that point, in her 90s herself. There's a small, almost overlooked detail that connects these 2 women across 70 years in a way nothing else quite does: the corgis. Elizabeth II kept corgis her entire life, a tradition inherited directly from her mother's own lifelong love of the breed. When the Queen Mother died in 2002, 2 of her corgis, named Sandy and Muick, passed to Elizabeth II, who kept them as living connections to the woman who had raised her, taught her, and shown her exactly how a queen was supposed to carry unbearable weight without ever letting the public see it bend her. When Elizabeth II herself died in September 2022, those same 2 corgis, Sandy and Muick, the Queen Mother's last dogs, the physical thread running from one generation of grieving queens to the next, passed once again, this time to Sarah Ferguson. A small, quiet detail. 2 dogs, outliving 2 queens, carrying a private piece of family history forward into a 3rd generation that had nothing to do with headlines or official statements. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The location matters. Balmoral was the same estate where her mother had once retreated in the aftermath of George VI's death 70 years earlier. The same corner of Scotland the Queen Mother had gone to when London and its cameras and its expectations became too much to bear. 70 years later, her daughter died in that same place, having lived through her own version of the exact pattern her mother had established: loss, silence, service, repeated without variation across an entire lifetime. Elizabeth II was 96 years old when she died. She had reigned for 70 years, longer than any other monarch in British history. And across all 70 of those years, across the deaths of her father, her sister, her mother, and finally her husband of 73 years, she never once sat down for a public interview about what any of it had actually cost her privately. Not one. Like her mother before her, the internal weight of that much loss simply never became public material. It stayed exactly where the Queen Mother had always kept hers, folded up, out of view, carried alone. 2 generations of queens. 2 women who buried husbands, siblings, and parents across a combined century and a half of public life, and who never once let the country see what any single one of those losses had actually done to them. Loss, silence, service. The pattern held, unbroken, from a 15-year-old girl writing letters for wounded soldiers at Glamis Castle in 1915, all the way to a 96-year-old monarch dying quietly at Balmoral in 2022. And that brings this story back to where it started. To a letter written by a 19-year-old girl about a boy who died in a Russian military hospital in 1919, and to the question this entire story has been building toward from the very first sentence: what does it actually cost a person to carry that much grief, for that long, without ever once putting it down where someone else could see it? Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4, 1900. She died on March 30, 2002, 101 years. She lived through 2 world wars and the reigns of 6 different monarchs. Across that span, she experienced more compounded personal loss than most people encounter across 5 separate lifetimes. She lost her brother Fergus at 15, his body buried in a quarry the family would spend nearly a century trying to locate. She lost Charlie, her first love, at 19, the only person, by her own account, she'd ever been able to speak to without pretending. She lost her freedom at 22, the moment she finally said yes to Bertie, fully aware of exactly what she was giving up. She lost her peaceful, private life at 36, the instant her brother-in-law chose Wallace Simpson over the crown and dropped an unwanted throne onto her husband's shoulders. She lost her husband at 51, watching him die in his sleep after 29 years of marriage and 6 years of wartime broadcasts that had visibly worn him down. She watched her youngest daughter's heart broken in her 50s by an institution that wouldn't let Margaret marry the man she loved, the same institution Elizabeth herself had once feared enough to say no to twice. She carried for decades the weight of a family secret involving 2 nieces locked away in an institution and falsely declared dead in the official aristocratic record, and at 101 years old, already frail, already fighting illness, she buried her youngest daughter, arriving at the funeral by helicopter, sitting through the service in a wheelchair with a freshly bandaged arm. And through every single one of those losses, spanning 87 years, she never once, not in an interview, not in a memoir, not in a single recorded public statement, asked the country to feel sorry for her. The woman the British public called the Queen Mum, the nation's grandmother, the smiling face on the balcony with the gin and tonic and the racehorses and the hats. That woman was carrying nearly a century of grief behind every single wave. Loss after loss after loss, folded up neatly and put away because she had decided, somewhere very early in her life, probably around the time she was 15 years old writing letters for soldiers who couldn't hold a pen themselves, that this was simply what duty required of her. Go back to the letter one more time. Charlie was the only one I could talk to in a completely natural and simple way. He was dear to me, and I miss him very much. She wrote those words at 19 years old. She carried them and everything they represented for 83 more years. She never mentioned Charlie publicly again. Not once, across an entire century of public life, interviews, biographies, and royal appearances. That's the grief she carried. That's the mask she built and wore, flawlessly, for nearly 90 years. And that's the actual cost, the private, unspoken, permanently carried cost, that the country watching her wave from that balcony never truly saw. There's more to this story worth telling properly. What actually happened to Princess Margaret, the full account of her years with Peter Townsend, the love she was forced to surrender in front of the entire country, and what that surrender did to her for the rest of her life. That's a story that deserves its own space, told with the same care. When you're ready for it, it'll be here. And if stories like this matter to you, told properly, with the facts and the respect they deserve, you're welcome to stay. If you want the rest of this story told the same way, properly, with the facts, with the respect it deserves, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you want to see what really happened between Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, click the video on your screen right now.